over the past few years, Europe has engaged meaningfully in the Indo-Pacific on the economic front, trade, digital partnerships, but the defense and security picture is a little bit less clear. Earlier this month, EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell addressed the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore and said, your security in the Indo-Pacific is an important part of our security, and expressed Europe's desire to have a meaningful and valuable role in the regional security architecture. But Europe's engagement militarily in the Indo-Pacific has been a little bit unfocused and a little bit uneven. So we're going to dig into what it could mean for Europe to play a meaningful role in deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. So I wanted to start by discussing the genesis of your report. Chris, let's start with you. Clearly, there's greater engagement from Europe in the Indo-Pacific over the past few years, also in terms of the military domain. But what prompted you right now to write this report?
Yeah, thanks, Lily. Great to be here. And Max, it was a lot of fun to work on this with you. So the genesis of this report was a conversation I had with a senior U.S. government official some months ago who was wrestling with some fundamental issues, I think, associated with Indo-Pacific Europe security cooperation. I mean, this administration has actively promoted deeper ties across these regions, right? The AUKUS initiative is sort of the best example of that, but they also encouraged the emergence of the so-called IP4 in the NATO context, drove or recommended sort of Indo-Pacific strategies, encouraged deployments to the region. So a lot of focus on building linkages. And there was clearly a response from Europe that, and sort of a desire in Europe that Max will get into as well. But I think what the administration also has wrestled with is, what are we trying to do here? What is the purpose? What are the objectives of engagement across these regions? And how? What are the mechanisms through which we should prosecute that engagement? This was at a time, I should note, relatively soon after the furor over the potential NATO office in Tokyo. You may remember that, where there was a brief discussion of opening a NATO office in Tokyo. There was backlash in Europe, backlash in the region, and it sort of quietly died. So I think the point here is there is a downside. We have to be thoughtful about how we advance cooperation between these two regions so that we don't play into Chinese narratives. And it was that package of things that I think prompted Max and I to take this on.
Great. Max, Chris mentioned the backlash to the NATO office coming from France. How are European states looking at this? What was kind of the motivation to look at Europe's military role here?
Well, I think, I sort of go back for me to Secretary of State Tony Blinken going to NATO for the first time. It was still COVID was still very present. It was March 2021. Russia obviously hadn't invaded Ukraine yet. And his speech at NATO was quite interesting because he mentioned China more than 10 times and Russia less than 5. And I think what that kind of indicated was the United States was telling Europe, look, China is a real strategic threat to the United States and also to the transatlantic alliance. In Europe, you need to take this more seriously. And I think that message was heard loud and clear. You've seen increase in European naval visits and passages through the Indo-Pacific. But there's always this tendency in Europe to sort of follow the United States. So NATO has sort of is an incredibly important transatlantic alliance, and oftentimes we ask ourselves, well, what value does NATO have to us? Well, NATO follows us. It follows our strategic priorities in Afghanistan, and NATO was not in the Sahel because the United States did not actually value or prioritize intervening in the Sahel and left that to France and the European Union. So I think what we're starting to ask is, well, is that actually useful for Europe to be sending ships, to be focused on trying to appease our kind of desire to focus on China when we have this major strategic threat to Europe in the form of Russia? And so I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine really changed the equation here. And we need to really think more clearly, and this is what this paper tries to do, is lay out what specifically does the United States want Europe to do militarily in the Indo-Pacific, or at least from a security perspective. And I think just maybe one other point on this is that sometimes we can be here in Washington very dismissive of Europe's role. We've been complaining about Europe underinvestment in defense for decades, and even going back during the Cold War period as well. But Europe is a very important player in the Indo-Pacific. Economically, it is a powerhouse. The EU has an economy the size of the United States, and China, it's one of the largest investors in the region. And Europe itself has the strategic interests of a superpower. It has just as much of an interest in a free and open Indo-Pacific as we do. It has thousands of Europeans are living in Taiwan. So Europe is going to be an actor and playing an actor, and we see this when it comes to China policy, especially on the economic side. So it's important for us to think about what military role do we envision Europe to play in this region. That's, I think, how I see this report and one of the major impetuses for it. And I think that was, to get to your question, I think that was actually sought after. Europeans are scratching their head. Okay, we get you want China mentioned in a NATO communique. Okay, we can do that. But what are you actually asking us to do?
Right. And just to add to that, 40% of Europe's trade goes through the South China Sea.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, the economic interests are there. Trade is a huge driver of European foreign policy. And I think that connection is there, right? Especially with this greater economic security mindset in Europe these days. Russia's invasion of Ukraine clearly showing that economics and supply chains are tied with national security, and there are national security vulnerabilities there, I think has created this more geopolitical mindset and more interest in engaging in the Indo-Pacific region. So I would hope that interest is there. I want to get into prognoses, but let's talk a little bit about some of the work you did for this report. Chris, I know that there were a few conversations that you had with Indo-Pacific partners about Europe's role in the region. Can you tell me a little bit about those and sort of what are the attitudes of key Indo-Pacific partners in terms of Europe's engagement?
Yeah, thanks, Lily. It's a great question. And just to sort of foot stomp one of the points that Max made, I think the purpose here is to try to chart an agenda that's realistic and meaningful in terms of a European contribution to security in the region, but also mitigate some of the downside risks associated with playing into narratives and so on that are unhelpful. So we can dig into some of that. But to talk a little bit about sort of perspectives from the region. So first, Max and I hosted a couple of different roundtables with scholars from around the region and also scholars in Europe as well. To exchange views on this in addition to the research we conducted. And I think, when you think about U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific, there is clearly a demand signal for deeper engagement with Europe. If you look at Japan, for example, Prime Minister Kishida has sort of been at the forefront of this view that security between the two regions is connected. His speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June 2022, Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. Ties to the idea of strengthening ties to European states is very much in the national security strategy Japan released later that year. Similarly, South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy in 2023 talks about building solidarity and cooperation with Europe. Australia's Defense Strategic Review highlights the importance of building ties with the EU, member states in Europe, and NATO. So all of this, I think, points in the direction of recognizing the value here of doing more together. But I think one point that's important to note is that the perspective is more mixed elsewhere in the region, right? When you think about ASEAN, the states of Southeast Asia, the Pacific Island countries, they welcome engagement. They welcome the engagement of European partners in security affairs in the region, but they're wary of formalizing it. And they're wary of using structures like NATO to advance it. Very strong reluctance to avoid the appearance of a region dividing into blocks. I think that was part of the context for the reaction to the potential NATO office in Tokyo. And of course, there's the Chinese seek to seize on this immediately by this, the rhetoric they used about the NATOization of Asia. And some of that, as silly as it sounds, has traction in places like Singapore and Indonesia. So the point is, European security engagement is welcome. It's particularly welcomed in a place that is, frankly, in search of more multipolarity. That's sort of the Southeast Asia view of what constitutes a stable order. But how that engagement takes place and where it's executed, through what mechanisms, is really important. And that's part of what we try to get into in the report.
Chris, can I just ask a follow-up question? In terms of our key Indo-Pacific allies, Japan, South Korea have shown a lot of support for Ukraine in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Is there any conversation around, maybe reciprocity is not the right word, but in terms of Europeans being more involved in regional contingencies?
I think that's definitely part of what's in the back of the mind of Kishida and Yoon, right? Like, we're showing up in Europe, in Europe's time of need, not Europe's time of need, what is a global crisis in Europe, and with the message that the expectation would be the same on their side if there was a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, a war on the Korean Peninsula, et cetera. So that I think definitely this sense that this needs to go both ways is certainly in the backdrop.
Great. Yeah. In terms of constraints on European engagement, there are clearly sort of narrative constraints that come from our relationships with ASEAN and other countries in the region. But from the perspective of European powers, Russia is clearly the main security focus. And Russia's war in Ukraine is an existential threat for the European Union, for European member states. To what extent does the sort of existence of a continued threat from Russia for the medium to long term act as a constraint on European willingness to consider a more active role in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I think it's a huge constraint, and let's be clear, Europe does have military capacity that could be of real value, I think, in a potential war scenario in the Indo-Pacific. The problem is that wouldn't happen in isolation, right? It wouldn't. It might, but I think the way we have to sort of imagine the future, especially seeing Russia-China relations, Russia-North Korea relations, is that Russia would act as essential, deterrent for Europe and fix U.S. forces or fix European forces. But Europe does have, they have more than 60 submarines. They have nuclear-powered submarines. They have more than 100 large surface vessels. There's lots of fifth-gen fighter jets in Europe, having bought F-35s in spades. So Europe does have military capacity, as much as we complain about it, that could be of real value. The question is, it would be a huge stretch, and it is a huge stretch for the Europeans to really be in the Indo-Pacific. They don't have the sort of same infrastructure that we have to support those sorts of operations. And given the threat posed by Russia, I think that really has to be the focus. Now, there are exceptions. France and the UK in particular, France having French territory being in the Pacific, the UK with Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. The AUKUS agreement has sort of cemented the UK being a real presence in the Indo-Pacific, also with ships in Singapore. And I think that's all to the interests of the United States. However, it's also really straining the defense budgets of both France and the UK, where they're trying to do everything militarily, both be in the Indo-Pacific, deter Russia, also, have the ability to conduct operations in Africa or the Middle East. So they're strained. I think when it comes to where should priorities be set, I think for Europeans, it's clear that has to be put on Russia. One thing maybe to just highlight is that one thing our report does, right? So you can get in a very a present state of mind where at this moment, Europe should not maybe prioritize having a military role, and therefore, folks at Indo-PACOM should just not pay attention to Europe. What we highlight is that Europe is actually going through a massive defense transformation. There are significant investments happening across Europe in their military forces. countries, more than 20 countries are now going to hit 2%. Some are hitting 4%. This defense modernization means that where Europe is today is not where Europe will be in 2030 or 2035, and we also don't know where the Russia threat will be. So it may be that in the present, short-term window, Europe has to be fixed on Russia, but perhaps medium term, there's more capacity there than present, and we don't know how the Russia threat will actually evolve.
Just to build on Max's great points, I think so. That points us in the direction of I think a particular way to think about the role of Europe, the role of the United States, and the interlinkages between these two theaters. So if we think about the possibility of a major Taiwan contingency, this would, of course, impose massive demands on the United States military. And although we don't like to talk about it, it's almost certainly the case that such a contingency would draw on U.S. assets around the world, including in Europe. We don't like to talk about that. We do a lot of hand-waving in our discussions with allies about the implications of a crisis in the other theater and what it would mean for them. Not a conversation we naturally have. But I think one of the points that Max and I make is it's time to have that conversation with the Europeans. What would a crisis in Asia mean for U.S. force posture in Europe? And therefore, where should Europe be focusing its investments? Because we could find ourselves, given the linkages between these two theaters, given a context in which Russia may seek to take advantage of U.S. focus in the Indo-Pacific, ensuring that Europe has the ability to sustain deterrence and respond to crisis at home while the U.S. is shifting focus to a Indo-Pacific crisis. Our national defense strategy sort of sets out in very vague terms the idea that we're constructing a force that can prevail against one peer competitor and preserve deterrence against another at the same time. That's undefined, right? But it speaks to the idea that it will be very hard for the United States to do both at once, and therefore it's time for an honest conversation with our allies about the linkages.
I want to talk about your ideas for where Europe can engage, but before I do, tough question to you, Max. Is Europe ready to have this conversation? I think that, in Brussels, there's clearly an advanced conversation about what a Taiwan contingency would look like. In the member states, maybe not so much. Where are kind of the main European players on this question?
So I think the main European player is actually right here in Washington, and it's us. I would sort of flip it. Are we ready to have that conversation? Because there is this concept that Europeans talk about. We did an event actually in this very room about a month ago on a European pillar of NATO. And the idea there isn't to sort of replace the United States, but for Europe to build redundance. Right now, if there's a war in Europe, if Russia were to come over the line in Estonia, it's actually the United States that starts to fight. And then NATO has a meeting, and hopefully NATO then gets involved, but it's the United States quarterbacking the effort, and also Europe relying on all these assets. So part of the question for us is, and this we don't really go into this in this paper because it's a longer conversation, is we like our position in Europe because we get to call the shots. And we actually don't actually want structural change in Europe, despite the fact us complaining about lack of European spending. We want Europe to spend a bit more, but us to still quarterback. Now, I don't think there's any threat to the United States not being the quarterback, but we want to have a backup quarterback. There needs to be an ability, I think, for Europe to fill the gaps and not be so fully dependent on us, because their forces don't, their ability to fight together, they don't buy the same equipment. It's a real, they haven't organized themselves to think as Europeans and fight as Europeans, and that would be a real strategic mindset, but it requires us, because of our position in NATO, actually wanting that to happen. And that will also require, that will be a major issue, structural challenge for the Europeans. Yet the one thing is we know Europe can integrate. The one area where it hasn't is on defense. And it's not because there hasn't been a desire. I mean, every other sector Europe is integrating in ways that are, in some ways jaw-dropping to people if they were to look at that 20, 30, 50 years ago. But on defense is sort of the last frontier. And so I think that's part of what's necessary here to build some of that resilience, that if the United States is fully focused over here, Now, we still may have U.S. Army and other assets, but Europe has to have this capacity to act. And I think that would be through NATO. NATO would be doing that role, but so there's going to be some real structural issues, but it's both U.S. and Europe having to kind of think about this together.
If I could just add on that, I think one thing I want to be clear about, we are not advocating that the United States should focus on the Indo-Pacific and sort of step away from its commitments in Europe. That's not at all the argument here. It's really sort of coming to terms with the reality that a major Indo-Pacific crisis would have implications for Europe that we need to talk about and prepare for. And I think that's a key sort of nuance here that I want to be sure isn't lost in our point.
Military planning is about planning for things that you really hope will never happen, right?
Yes.
But it seems incumbent upon us to plan for a scenario that is imaginable. We really hope will never happen, but that is a scenario in which U.S. is pulled in all directions and Europe really has to step up.
And it's in the context of this focus on being able to fill the gaps. With that as the backdrop, it's from that premise that then, in our view, European states should think about engaging the Indo-Pacific, but with that foundation and premise as the starting point.
Right. So Max mentioned that, if we look 10 years out, 15 years out, we don't know how the Russian threat will evolve. We know that Europe is investing in its defense and security capabilities and will be a capable actor able to engage. Let's talk about what you recommend. I love this report because it has so many concrete recommendations. I think 12 concrete recommendations. So maybe we can split them up between you two. But let's dig into your recommendations here. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, sure. So we'll do a couple at a time or something. But I think the first point is how to think about NATO is maybe the first point to make here. Because we're about to have the NATO summit here in Washington. The IP4, or at least the IP3, are going to be present. It sounds like it may not. The Australian Prime Minister is a bit uncertain. We'll see. So I think it's important to think about how NATO fits into this. And where Max and I come down is NATO has an important role to play, but that role is primarily in Brussels and in Washington. In other words, bring Asian partners to NATO for the information sharing, for discussion of best practices, for discuss things like standards for weapons production. That's an incredibly valuable conversation, important conversation to have, and building out an agenda focused on those areas is really important. Lessons learned from coalition warfare, that's another sort of area where I think NATO can be helpful, but not in Asia, where I think, in other words, not bringing a NATO structure to Asia. In our view, there's more downside than upside to that. So that's one point. In Asia itself, our view is that bilaterally, individual member states, minilateral groupings, the EU itself, Max will talk about some of that, is the best place to focus. So maybe I'll start with that point.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, and I think militarily, we sort of see Europe's role as covering the flanks, so to speak, where if the U.S. is engaged in, and we obviously hope this will never happen, but this is a contingency planning, in a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, that protecting sea lanes of communication in the Mediterranean, Red Sea, which we're already seeing are potential choke points. That's a key role that Europe can play. It's close to home. It also would be critically important for the United States. So I think that's one area where Europe can really focus. We mentioned before, also Europe should invest in capabilities that are in short supply, that the United States may pull out, whether that's air capabilities such as air tankers, strategic lift, but also various ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, various assets that the United States really provides to the alliance that may want in the Indo-Pacific if U.S. forces are under fire. So I think that's those are kind of key areas, and we're not quite seeing Europe really focus its defense investments in those areas.
Mm-hmm. And can I just follow up on that? Is that a question of sort of EU-wide engagement, or is it certain players that are already more active in the Indo-Pacific in terms of France, Netherlands, Germany?
So I think this is where one of the big challenges, and this is a challenge for European defense cooperation is you have these big kind of strategic assets like air tankers that are very expensive. And actually, it's a prime example of European defense cooperation right now is that there's something called the European Air Transport Command, where Europeans pool the money to jointly buy these systems. And I think what the problem is that hasn't happened at the scale needed. So there needs to sort of be the scaling up to really focus on how do you get forces in Portugal to Estonia if you're engaging in a fight with the Russians, and how do you move forces across Europe? How do you keep your fighter jets in the air? Those sorts of things that Europeans don't quite have to focus on because that's what the U.S. provides, those sort of capabilities.
Chris, you talk about INDOPACOM in the report. You want to say more on?
Yeah, sure. So, a couple of recommendations we make related to that today, and thinking about expanding and building connections between European partners and INDOPACOM. Right. Today, just France and the UK have liaison officers at INDOPACOM. There are a few others that have expressed interest. And I think it's our view that expanding that presence at INDOPACOM would be positive. I do think at the same time, though, that presence should be more explicitly and directly linked to contingency planning, peacetime operational planning, security assistance in the region. In other words, expanding presence at INDOPACOM should also come with the intent to offer concrete contributions in various ways to the effort in the Indo-Pacific. So engagement should be connected to planning. Second point I'd make on this, we're about to have the RIMPAC exercise, which takes place every 2 years. Number of European partners are going to be participating in that, the Germans, the Italians, the French, the British, whole range of partners, which is terrific. One of our points here is practice presence with a purpose. In other words, come with real operational objectives you're trying to advance on these deployments. It's not naval tourism. Come with, so for example, use those deployments specifically to challenge what are widely seen as illegitimate Chinese maritime claims. Conduct a Taiwan Strait transit. UK Navy has done this. The Dutch frigate just did this a couple of weeks ago. That kind of thing should be routine. Challenge maritime claims in the South China Sea. Pick a feature, conduct an innocent passage operation. In other words, when you come to the region, bring with it a real purpose that serves to reinforce larger goals that we all have on behalf of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and so on. So those two things, expanding presence at INDOPACOM and also bringing presence with a purpose when you show up.
Right.
And just to maybe add to that, I think this is where Europe provides real added value. They're signatories to the Law of the Sea Treaty. Europeans, the EU and European countries are seen as, I think, more as really focused on upholding, the international norms, sometimes more than we are. And so those sorts of statements, I think, send a real message. One of the other recommendations that we highlight, while we sort of say NATO should sort of stay back and stay in Europe, we do think that there's a role for the EU in having an EU naval mission in the Indo-Pacific. The EU has done maritime operations off the maritime missions, combating piracy in the Gulf of Guinea and off the coast of Somalia. They're currently operating the Red Sea. And the reason for this is not so much just to have the EU, flag flying and the kind of naval tourism, but Europe's main deterrent power and capability when it comes to China is its economic leverage. It's the economic leverage of the European Union, which is, a tremendously powerful economic actor. And currently, the military dimension is done at a national level, not linked to that economic tool, that sanctions tool, which would be done at the EU level. So merely having an EU naval mission, which is effectively the EU coordinating its national countries, doing ship visits or ship passages, would at least at the very least link the military dimension and the economic dimension together, and I think that could send an important signal to China.
And just to add on that, I think an EU flagged naval mission has different connotations in the region, right? Doesn't produce the same reactions in Southeast Asia,
Right.
that the NATO imprimatur might. So I think that's another rationale for building out naval activity under the EU flag.
Right. Also makes it easier for European member states to engage under an EU flag
Yeah.
Yeah.
when it has to do with even subtly confronting China.
Yeah,
It's good for both.
And there may be more European participants because it gives a degree of coverage. And to be fair, the EU has created something in typical Brussels speak, the anti-coercion instrument after China's sort of aggressive retaliation against Lithuania when it increased its diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. And the EU sort of struggled to respond because this was an attack on its single market by attacking a single the economy of a single member state. But the EU now has figured out, okay, we need economic tools, and so it would be linking those economic tools that the EU has potentially with its military dimension.
Is there any possibility for sort of defense industrial based cooperation here?
Yeah, I think. I think this has to be a major priority for the NATO alliance, and frankly, it is right now. And when we have the NATO summit here in a couple of weeks, defense industrial production is going to be a big focus. But I think it really has an Indo-Pacific dimension, and I think this is where the United States needs to be a little bit more creative and thoughtful, and our European partners as well. When CSIS, some of our colleagues have done war games about what happens if we get in a shooting war with China. It turns out we run out of a lot of our very high-end munitions very, very quickly. And as Europe is ramping up its defense production, and as we potentially are too, we should make sure that those ammunition can be used on platforms. We're finding right now in Ukraine that not all 155 artillery is the same, can be used on the same platforms. And so I think this is where NATO's role is really critical in setting sort of armament standards. And especially as systems get more complicated, what we have to realize is that the kind of bespoke value of these very high-end expensive systems, sure, but we also need to be able to produce in mass. And I think leveraging the European defense industrial base for the US is critical. It's also critical for the Europeans because, look, they bought all these F-35s. If we're going to be in a war in the Indo-Pacific and running short of ammunition, the Europeans may need that ammunition as well. So this is a joint transatlantic challenge. And we weren't really thinking about this, pre-Russia-Ukraine because we were very focused on counterterrorism. We weren't expending munitions in the same conventional way. So I think that has to be a major focus for the alliance and is a major attribute for the United States that we could potentially rely on Europe and vice versa.
One thing that struck me is that Europe can play a role in, Chinese foreign policy is very U.S. focused, right? It's all about the U.S. U.S. started de-risking, U.S. is destabilizing the Indo-Pacific. This Asian NATOization narrative that you mentioned, Chris, Europe can sort of help push back on that, I think, as well. In terms of countering disinformation, sort of the cyber domain as well, and just in sort of reiterating the importance of peace and stability in Asia to these capitals that are susceptible to that narrative that it is the United States that is the destabilizing actor, greater visibility in terms of Chinese military practices in the region. That's important. It's important that is maybe not done by the United States, but instead by a third party. And I think that can be maybe another area where Europe can contribute.
Couldn't agree more, Lily. I think adding Europe's voice on these issues is incredibly important. When I was in the White House, it was always our goal to get language on the Taiwan Strait into any joint statement, to just drive home the message that peace and stability across the strait is not a U.S.-China issue. It's a global issue, and the world is engaged on it. And I think you can apply that to the South China Sea. You can apply it to a whole range of issues that involve China. So definitely, I think on the messaging piece, critical role to play. I also agree with your point on disinformation. Europe has a long experience combating Russian disinformation, right? And various mechanisms under NATO and outside of NATO that are organized to do that. None of that exists in Asia, and yet there's a growing disinformation challenge that's both both Chinese and Russian. So I think there's a lot of lessons learned
Right.
that U.S. partners in Asia can glean from the European experience. So I think disinformation is another great area. And I think also sort of building on Max's points on the defense industrial base, there's also the security assistance
Yeah.
agenda, right? Where the needs of our partners, particularly in Southeast Asia, are vast. When you think about the maritime domain, right? U.S. has increased our budgets. The Japanese have a significant budget. The Australians do things. But I think there would be benefit in bringing Europe to the table in terms of meeting the capability requirements of our partners. That's hard to do, and you really need to coordinate it so you don't end up with a hodgepodge of different systems that can't talk to each other.
Right.
But clearly a role that Europe could play in helping countries defend their sovereignty.
Yeah, maybe just, I think the security assistance point, I think, is a real avenue for Europe to play an expanded role. In particular, because the United States doesn't always have, sometimes we try to give away military aid to countries that don't really want to take it. And this is where Europe can sometimes have an added value because it's sort of a flexible actor. Sometimes it's the nation state. So, France and India, for instance, have a very robust defense cooperation, while some European countries have colonial legacies, some don't in various countries, and then you have the EU, which is sort of this faceless actor, where I think many in the region see it as effectively an economic player, and are sort of surprised that it might have this military assistance tool. And just to unpack this a little bit, at the beginning of the last European Commission in 2019, they created the European Peace Facility, which in typical European speak is a European security assistance tool, with actually had quite a bit of funding, about $1 billion a year in funding, and that has once the war in Ukraine started, that fund has been used for Ukraine, and the amount of money going to that has increased dramatically. Now, over time, it's going to rebalance a bit, and potentially has a real Indo-Pacific potential. I was in Northern Europe recently and met with a naval commander who talked about how they're increasing defense spending, they're buying new naval ships, and I asked about, well, what are you doing with this old ship that looks pretty good? And the answer is, well, what most countries do when they buy new is that they just sort of divest. Whoever is going to buy it, however they can dispose of it in the most economically advantageous way. And in the United States, when we have old Coast Guard ships, this is a huge opportunity for security cooperation. In fact, our old Coast Guard ships are, a part of the backbone of the Navy of the Philippines and Vietnam. It's a big competition for countries to get in line to get this, but you have to devote money and security assistance to refurbishing these ships. But as Europe is modernizing its navies and its militaries, there's going to be lots of security cooperation opportunities. And for Europeans, as they're increasing their defense spending and increasing their defense production, also opportunities to expand security assistance. So I think that's an area where there should really be more coordination between the U.S. and Europe. And I think that's where the U.S.-EU security dialogue could probably do a bit more to focus on that aspect, because it's, I think, a potential growth area.
And that's a place where plugging into Indo-PACOM is part of the
Yeah.
picture too, right?
Raising
'Cause
awareness, right?
Raising awareness, but also the role that Indo-PACOM plays in our own, in U.S.'s security assistance. So that's a place to sort of understand how to complement and advance.
Right.
And it's not just the platforms, right, Max? I want to give you a chance to talk about what I think is one of the most interesting ideas
I was going
in
to
this.
ask next. We have to talk about
go ahead and
engagement between states in the Baltic and South China Sea. I think that's what you were getting at, Chris.
Yeah.
where I was
So, part of I remember being at the State Department the last, after Russia invaded Ukraine the first time, and part of the U.S. sort of policy response is, well, we need to get the Baltic states to talk more together. Baltic-Nordic cooperation, especially in the military space, needs to be expanded, and a lot has happened over the last 10 years. But when you think about the challenges in the Baltic Sea and the challenges in the South China Sea, now one is warm, one is cold, so there are differences, but they're both shallow bodies of water. You have the Chinese as an actor in the South China Sea with really pushing its territorial claims, but Russia also constantly violating the maritime exclusive economic zones, the airspace, and in similar challenges of a kind of revisionist great power really asserting itself in both naval domains. And I think there's a lot of room for potential collaboration, for potential engagement, best practices. What are the tactics that the Philippines are seeing? What are the Finns seeing? What are the Swedes experiencing? And then also, hopefully, that fosters greater diplomatic, military, economic engagement, because these are very wealthy countries, particularly the Nordic countries in Europe, and potential security cooperation opportunities could stem from that. And so I think that's part of we've thought about networking our allies more, and we're seeing that with Asian allies coming to NATO. But there's perhaps ways to do this below just our allies, but with countries like Vietnam and others that we're trying to engage more with. We would like them to engage more with our European partners.
So I think what you're hearing here, right, is there are a number of, and we've identified 11 or 12 of them, no doubt there are more, number of meaningful ways that European states can contribute in concrete, practical ways to the security environment in East Asia. But it's all about being deliberate and focused on what the objectives are. And so I think that's sort of the overarching theme here.
Right. I was thinking as I was reading this report that a useful next step would also be to look at kind of the conversation in individual European member states on this, right? Yeah. Because one of the arguments you're making is that it needs to be deliberate and credible, and there's potential for EU-wide action, but it's also about targeting the right partners, right? Standardization in general, but targeting the right equipment, targeting what each, the sort of strategic advantages of each European member state has to contribute. And just thinking about, evaluating which are sort of the main players that we need to target here in a deliberate way, and integrate through Indo-PACOM or other mechanisms to make a meaningful contribution. So definitely more work to be done. I can't recommend this report enough. I think it really starts a conversation. I think there's a lot of sort of romancing of the problem of how, Europe, Indo-Pacific, this one theater concept these days, right? And certainly I would have to say, as someone who looks at China's done its own work for us, if you will, in sort of, creating this very clear connection in its relationship with Russia between the European security domain and the Indo-Pacific security domain. And certainly just over the past weeks with the tightening Russia-North Korea ties, we're reinforcing that idea. So, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to add one thing.
Please do.
Lily, thank you for moderating. Chris, it's been great working with you. I think you're both right that there's a lot more to kind of develop here, right? These are sort of ideas that then need to sort of be challenged and poked. And in part, one of the challenges with, I think, this topic is it requires, and what was most really fascinating about working on it, is that you have Europe hands that are used to really dealing with the United States, and in Asia hands not really used to dealing with Europe, but dealing with Asian partners, and Asian allies used to dealing with the United States. And so it requires a more complex set of engagements, right? The trilateral engagements. And I think there's going to be a lot of, effort into some things that may not work, but were probably worth trying. And then other areas that are that we hadn't thought about will then lead to real opportunities. And I think that's part of what we're kind of pointing here, is that there's a lot of potential for U.S. for European security collaboration in Asia, and in that I think the United States has a critical role in fostering that. It's also incumbent upon the Europeans to probably provide some more actionable plans, but for us to not put pressure on them to say, well, we expect you to be right there with us and put everything behind us when we're engaged, and really provide them with clear guidance on what we're actually looking for.
And I think also thinking flexibly about that role,
Yeah.
right? I mean, this report is about military engagement, but there's clearly, non-traditional security threats that Europe is just extremely well placed to deal with: the disinformation, the cyber domain, economic security,
Of course.
right? These are issues that the European thrives at, is a know-how power, if you will, that has a lot to contribute. So I think there's a lot more research to be done.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, and I should say we deliberately focused on the military security
Right.
questions, but there's, just as you say, there's development assistance, there's a whole range of areas where that are also worth exploring and getting into, where there's clearly a role European countries can play.
Right.